All right, thank you, Kenneth. So let's just switch over. Now, there are a few interesting things that you always experience when you come to a conference. One of them is, whenever you go, for example, when I went to a conference in Zurich last week, you come to a conference in Zurich, no coffee is allowed in the auditorium. You go to Germany, no coffee is allowed in the auditorium. You go to Amsterdam, no coffee is allowed in the auditorium. You go to Copenhagen, yay! That's pretty cool. It's already a good start. I did notice a couple of few things which kind of keep me annoying, because we have 5 extra minutes anyway. I'm just really annoyed, maybe a little bit confused. It's kind of weird. So I was flying with Scandinavian Airlines from Frankfurt to Copenhagen, and they have the safety measures and everything as first explained in English, and then, quote, in a Scandinavian language. What does it mean? There is no Scandinavian language, like the Scandinavian language, right? So I was totally confused. You also have really small bathrooms, like everywhere, all over the place, Airbnbs and everything. It's really kind of interesting, even smaller than Amsterdam. It's like I'm trying to find the record, like with the smallest bathroom. It's not that I care about bathrooms so much. This is why I keep repeating the word bathroom. But it's like it's a thing, all right? Okay, so we're not supposed to talk about that. That is like there are always a few things that you kind of can find interesting in at a new place. So today we're going to talk about not bathrooms, but real-life responsive web design. So I spent a lot of time traveling, and I spent a lot of time doing some sort of responsive design work from the UX design perspective, from performance perspective. And it's always great because you always end up working with these companies that tend to have, well, similar problems or very different problems, and I kind of tend to use the technique that we discover and put them in the workshop right here, or in the talk right here, that we actually use then to, to get better. And I think it's really, really important. Now, this is how I used to look like back in the day. Oh, this is big, like really big. So things change over time, as you can see, right? I'm still running Smashing Mac. Kind of basically every single article that goes on the site goes through me, more or less, right? But I also do a lot of other things at the time as well. Now, when I think about the web, right? Obviously, Smashing Mac is responsive. But as designers or front-end engineers, we probably see the web a bit differently. We see lots of rectangles everywhere. We kind of like boxes. They're predictable. They're squarey, right? We like boxes and we see them everywhere. In fact, there are many different boxes, and our job is basically to align those boxes to make sure that things work and scale up and down as we like. In fact, there are many, 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 many boxes, right? This is the view that we have of responsive design. Basically just a lot of different boxes, a lot of different form factors that we have to design for. And I think that this is very misleading, because we have to rethink entirely how we see responsive design. It's much more complex than that. It's not just layout, of course, and it's not just a few little rectangles. And in this talk today, I don't want really to talk about those boxes. I really want to kind of break out of the box. I don't want to talk about trends, because I don't care for trends at all. So it's also not about frameworks. I don't care for frameworks either. It's more about techniques, and more specifically design patterns and experiments and solutions that I just find or that we discover and then we can use. Now, it doesn't mean that you will be able to use all of them, but they might give you a good idea where to start when you encounter a similar problem, right? And again, it's not a trend, so we're not going to talk about those familiar, well-known things like off-canvas navigation or things like that. We know this. I'm more interested in things that are kind of more obscure than that. I think that design patterns per se have a really bad reputation in the community. They're often seen as those off-the-shelf components that you can apply to your work right away and call design, right? I don't think that's true, because design patterns can help in many, many different ways, primarily because of the design process that we have. Now, the design process is very weird and complicated because it involves people and organizations which often are weird and complicated, right? I don't know about Denmark, but it's totally true in Germany, totally true. And the main reason for this is that many companies, or many managers in many companies, see that creative process looks a bit more like this, right? Kind of like this, where you start somewhere at some point, and then you iterate, and iterate, and iterate, and iterate, and iterate, and refine, and improve, and then iterate, and improve, and improve, and improve, and at some point you reach the finish line, right? Now, it doesn't look like that for me at all, right? Because to me, it looks a bit more like this, right? Where you start somewhere, and you start exploring, and you start diverging, and then at some point you want to converge again, but you might be hitting a dead end. Or you maybe explore one of the ideas, and you think it's really good, but then you again keep kind of evolve and keep exploring, and then you hit a dead end. And for me, recovering from those dead ends is really, really time-consuming. Kind of not being able to know what to do next is really time-consuming. So if I can rely on a design pattern at this point and move to the next idea, that's really helpful because it really saves time. And it doesn't mean that we're going to use one idea one-to-one, but we can build on top of it. And we can actually be really creative once we have an idea where to move. So design patterns for me personally, which is why I kind of emphasize it at this point, is really, really help recover from those time-consuming and frustrating dead ends. They reroute our decision-making, right? I think it's really critical. Now, when we start designing today, when we build responsive sites, very often we tend to think not about designing pages, but systems, right? While designing a mock-up like this might take a while if you just go to Photoshop and start, sketching it all out. It has lots of different things going on, lots of art-directed features, pull quotes, block quotes, and so on and so forth. Just a regular magazine article, but there are lots of components that it has, right? These are all the components that go on this page. Now, thinking of all of this and kind of putting it all together in one Photoshop mockup will take a lot of time, which is why we tend to spend more time thinking about components, right? So we try to separate those designs into components, reusable modules, and put things together like Lego blocks to create a design that works, which can be really, really effective, of course, right? Then at some point, you do have the page. And the reason why I bring it up here is because this construction, right, this construction of a design using modules really requires you to think, well, to think in those modules, right, to think in patterns. Like, how do you deal with tables? How do you deal with forms? How do you deal with all of those things? This is the story of my life. I don't like web forms, but I spent way too much time filling in web forms. Now, why are they so annoying? Web forms are just one of the components we have. So maybe we can make them better, or maybe we can look at how people do them better. So how many of you are familiar with this? Now, this is a toolbox. This is an IBM Toolbox, which was recommended to use to type in data and maintain a machine back in 1953, right? Now, the times have changed, of course, but we still, in many cases, have this really ridiculous, old-fashioned understanding of how the web works. This happens to me all the time. Have a client, and they want me to sign a contract, scan it, well, print it, of course, first, scan it, well, wait a second, print, sign, scan, send. Well, because I'm traveling so much, I don't have a portable scanner with me, I don't have a portable printer with me, and I do travel a lot. So what do? Well, I do a screen grab, I add my digital signature, I rotate slightly, I add some visual noise with Photoshop, and I send it by email, right? It works like charm every single time. But why do we need to print out and sometimes even fax is out of my understanding. I just don't get it. Now, the same goes for forms. Some forms are just ridiculous. So if you want to go to the UK and you're not a citizen of, not a European citizen, well, because I was a citizen of the Republic of Belarus, well, the first thing you find out is that you have an other passport. Thank you very much. That's very kind of you. I'm other passport. But more importantly, I have to enter all characters exactly as they appear on the ID, including letters, numbers, and symbols. Why I need to type in the symbols is out of my understanding either, but I do have to do it, otherwise it's not going to move forward, right? It's just totally strange. Now, some forms are just ridiculous, others are just evil. And when I talk about evil companies, I have a specific company in mind. Hello, Internet. I do stand for this. So if you, basically, actually, I applied for a job in Ryanair for the UI designer. So if you're looking at it, give me a call. So, Ryanair, I really do not like Ryanair, but they don't like me either, so it's perfectly fine. But there is a problem with Ryanair. There are actually two problems with Ryanair. The first one is Ryanair Exhibit A. I looked up fare yesterday, total of £123, returned today, and fare to £237. Flushed cookies, fare back to £123. So this is probably the best thing you learned today, right? So if you want to reduce the amount of money you spend on flights, just always use incognito mode, and sometimes you can pretend to have a Polish IP because you get lower prices. Unless you want to really screw up your company, pretend that you are from Norway or from Switzerland, prices will be adjusted. Just so you know the internet. The other thing is, if you do want, well, normally when you buy a flight book a flight with Ryanair, the insurance is added in, but you can opt out if you know how to opt out. It's conveniently located between Denmark and Finland in country selector. So I hope that I screwed up Ryanair right now at this point. Just a few years ago, when I arrived in Copenhagen, this was the form that I had, to see, to fill in, to get to internet. Now it's actually much better, but I still feel like these forms are everywhere, right? And they're really annoying. They feel like work. This really feels like I have to fill in so many fields. I'm just wondering why I don't have to confirm my first name and last name at this point. This is just weird. So much work. And this feels like much work too. You just want to book a car to get from one place to another. You have to fill in all these fields. It's kind of annoying, a lot of work, right? This doesn't feel like that much work, right? It's actually the same, it's a different experience obviously, but it's the same task. In this case, I just have to order a car to get from A to B. But it doesn't feel like work here. Kind of like people's Uber here and rickshaw, Uber, kind of nice. And you have Uber here in Copenhagen too. But it's very interesting just to see that this is a very different perception, right? So maybe we should rethink the way we design interfaces at all. Because again, if you compare these two interfaces, right? On the left, it's like filling in a web form. On the right, it feels like more like interface, right? And the only difference here is that if you want to change something in here, well, there's smart defaults in use. You can just tap on one of the areas and then edit it, right? You don't see the web form here. You actually see an interface. It's obvious. It feels like progress, which is really great. And some companies or some services are trying to really push this idea further. So Typeform is one of them, where it's really more about forms. So how can we make forms better? So what if we just focus on one thing, which we should do when you type, when you fill in a form, which is typing. You should be focusing on typing. You should never have to use a mouse. You should never have to use a select drop-down, for example. You just type. You're always on the keys. So you want to select something, A, B, C, D. You want to say yes or no, Y for yes and for no, right? You want to select something like a check mark, you can just use A, B, and so on and so forth, right? And in order to move between the input fields, because obviously you see only one input field at a time, always, you can use this interface controls at the bottom, right? Doesn't feel like that much work. Still, web form, of course, but doesn't feel like that much work. And then things like this could be fun, right? Like a medical report, where you can just easily select with your keyword okay, this is no fun. But in general, this is doesn't feel like a lot of work. And this is what Virgin Airlines have been doing, where it's really more about putting only one thing at a time in focus, right? So you're focusing on only one thing. And if you select, flights or whatever, you will only see either one input field or only one select drop-down, but only one at a time, which is kind of interesting. We could try to do that more as well. Now, web forms can be easily improved. I don't know if you can see it in the back, but this is a regular slider, but you can also add some metadata here to the slider. So if you're using Airbnb, you'll find the little bars in the back where they actually show you what is the average pricing where you'll find most apartments in, right? Kind of a little enhancement that really helps. Now, very often, we also don't need address line 2, because nobody really knows what it means anyway, right? So we can add it if people need to type in this data, but we don't have to provide it. When it comes to sensitive data, we can actually always include something like an information overlay, an information button, right? So people know why they need to provide this important input, like telephone data or email, anything else. In fact, of course, email is very important. So while we're on it, we can just use auto-suggest, kind of look into our database for what email clients or what email addresses our users are using, then just provide auto-suggest based on this data. And also, because emails are so important, we could also, for very important and critical forms, just to make sure that the email is correct, because we want to get the correct email address, we can just verify the email address. So you fill in the form, and instead of actually confirming the email, you can just ask people to look at it again, and if there are mistakes, they can actually verify it. Because, as we know, and as tests say, what do most people do when they have to verify an email? You know that because you do that as well. 60% of users consistently copy-paste the email when asked to verify it in the checkout. So if they have a mistake in the first input field in the first place, they're going to carry it over to the repetition anyway. So there is no point of having this verification thing at all. It's just not necessary. Instead, it's better to use something like inline autocomplete. You are familiar with this floating label pattern, right? It's being used quite a lot. But very often it's not responsive, but it can be, right? This is a little experiment where if you don't have space, for example, to keep this placeholder in place, you can just move it a little bit, or kind of change its position. That's really not a big deal, but it can help as well. We often tend to reserve, I know it's going fast, and you'll get all the slides nevertheless, don't worry, but I think it's really important. All those things really sum up. So, for example, we tend to dedicate, I don't know, 5, 10 lines in the text area, which occupies a lot of space, especially on mobile. So this text area could be growing automatically. We don't need to, occupy that much space to it. I know that some countries require you to provide your year of birth when you access specific websites, but, and this is a loophole in law, sometimes you really care about, most of the time actually, you really care about the year, not the exact day and not the exact month. And because most people lie anyway, just make it easier for them to lie. So just ask for the year of birth instead of actually asking for the exact day and the exact month, because they will lie anyway, right? The same goes for country selector, which is like the selector, the drop-down. This is unbelievable. I actually kind of hoped that Scotland would make it, just so that lists would grow, but they didn't make it. Okay, bad joke, I'm sorry. Right. But it's really, you never know, right? You never know. Where will you look for? Like if you're looking for Netherlands, or Holland, or the Netherlands, or is Netherlands going to be prioritized and showed up in the first 10 items, or is it somewhere in the middle of this list? Have to scroll endlessly. This is just unbelievable. We don't need that. We can just kindly ask the user to type in the first 1 or 2 or 3 characters of their country, right? And for example, it doesn't matter if it's Schweiz or Switzerland or CH, he'll be just recognized because it's a synonym. The same goes for Deutschland, Germany, DE. It's the same thing. And the same goes, of course, for Netherlands, NL, Holland, the Netherlands, and so on, right? And sometimes we don't even need to ask for the country because we can just ask for the zip code. There is a fantastic Zippopotamus library which contains all the different zip codes. And based on the zip code alone, sometimes you can predict the street and sometimes you can predict the country and everything else, unless you are in Russia or India, because it's not consistent there. But in most sorry, it was politically incorrect. In most countries, you can actually predict the state and the city based on the zip code alone, right? So instead of asking for the street, you could just ask for the zip code and then actually pre-fill the city and the state. And you, of course, also know this credit card one credit card input field. So I'm not going to show it to you, right? But what's really interesting are those seals in e-commerce. So I've been doing a lot of e-commerce work over the last few months. And it's remarkable to see what's happening when you actually exchange those seals and see what's happening. So who feels really confident seeing one of those seals? Does it give you some sense of confidence about the checkout? Do you feel more like, wow, this is going to be secure and this is going to be really, really good? So as it turns out, there are specific preferences when it comes to people trusting those seals. And this is what it looks like. If you ask people what badge gives them the most sense of confidence, they would say that Norton and Markup Secure are the ones, right? So in other words, if you want to make your form feel a little bit more secure, you know what to do, right? But you need to, of course, apply for this badge. You can't just copy-paste it. Well, you can, but it's not, well, it's illegal, right? But it really boosts the conversion rate in many, many cases. So these two designs are very similar. The only difference is the lock, and we have this one of those logos, and we have a darker background, gray background. But it really boosts conversion rate. It's quite unbelievable. So adding these noticeable visual clues are really, really important. So as you can see, we can do a lot when it comes to web forms. And if you're looking for a really nice example for this, this is a really beautiful, responsive e-commerce website. And the interesting thing is, you might have heard about the state of mobile today. We have, of course, taller devices, but we tend to use, we can't use the thumb anymore when you want to reach the left upper corner or right upper corner, well, many times. So it might be useful to keep important things at the bottom, right? Those interface controls like next, checkout, or cart, things like that, right? Here it's also interesting to see like a product with three different images, which are just displayed as free images in three columns in a large view, kind of getting squeezed into a slider in a small view. And also everything is really almost seamless. Just a very nice, very nice piece of design. And you can actually just go to the page and play a little bit with it. You can buy something, you don't have to, obviously, but the checkout is really, really beautiful. It's one of the best examples, I think, of what we can do with forms. So just to sum up what we can do today, it's really simple. If you can provide some sort of input with one tap or one click, that's always a good thing. If you can avoid input fields, if you can avoid select dropdowns, do that. We should probably prefer radio buttons and sliders because they're so easier to navigate, so much easier to navigate. Email verification is not necessary. Lengthy input is also very often not necessary. We can make use of zip code as well, right? So this is web forms. We can do a lot already just by doing this, right? But there are also other components, of course, we have to keep in mind. For example, tables and calendars. Now, tables are no fun most of the time because it looks like this still, right? Where we have to zoom in and zoom out and zoom in and zoom out and swim in this ocean of the table, in the table. Well, there is a very sophisticated pattern you can use pretty much everywhere, where instead of guessing what to display and how to display it, we can just ask the users to select what they want to see. Well, by default, we should make smart decisions about what columns they should see, right? And they can actually use those interface components here, elements here. They can actually click on the button, display all, and then they will see all the columns, right? Or they can use the display and then select what they actually want to see, because maybe they don't need all of this, right? At the same time, what I think should be activated by default is this focus mode, as you can see on the left, where when we tap on a column or on a row, it should be highlighted. Especially if you have lots of columns, it might be really useful to be able to navigate between these data points, right? So you know exactly what's happening. So you tap somewhere, and then you can actually navigate even within this iframe, right? And it's being used, for example, it's being used by Muse, which was developed by Friedman Group, right? Where they have a complex data grid. And the idea is, I think the navigation, all right, it's right here. So you just tap whatever you have to change, but then you also can select what you want to see, and you can actually have this little switch kind of steps moving between those areas, which is kind of nice, right? Now, you can do something entirely different with tables. I mean, just because you can, I guess. If you have a lot of data that you could potentially visualize, well, you could choose to visualize it, right? So you could turn this mega table into a chart. Well, you could. Now, the reason is, the question I'm asking myself at this point is, well, if you can show a chart in a small view, why would you want to show a chart, to show a table in a large view? But it might be an interesting idea to show both, right? So you could actually show the chart by default in a small view with the link to the table view, right? So people can actually switch between those modes. But in a large view, you could actually show the table if you want to, if you need to, but also allow people to switch to the graph, to the chart, right? That would make a pretty interesting experience. If you have a very specific table like this, where you have lots of radio buttons, I don't know if you can actually see it in the back, which is a very common pattern, like a matrix pattern. If you select a flight or book a ticket anywhere, this is going to be all over the place. You could tend to maybe save a little bit of vertical space by tilting the headers, right? I mean, it depends, of course, on what you have here. If you have too much content, you won't be able, nobody will be able to read it, right? But it might be useful if you do need to show all of it, and this is kind of an important area to show, right? Another thing you can also do is to actually really just show the columns in steps. So you could have something like a progress indicator over there, and you could have a few interface controls, allowing users to basically slide from one area to another. So if you can show everything, you show everything. But if you can't, then you actually indicate that there is something else as well, right? So you can click on this interface control over here and kind of move in steps. But one of those columns is going to stay fixed, right? It's also a very simple pattern that could be used in many, many, many scenarios. But sometimes you can't just decide to drop columns. I mean, there are things like calendars, right? If you have a calendar, you can't just say, I'm going to drop all Fridays, because they're not important, right? You can't do that, because there is a consistency that is required in the structure of a table at this point. And here again, you have Muse application, which has a few highlighted items, like 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And a few other things. And here you've got the dates, right? And here you've got the time, okay? So obviously, you could try to squeeze it in, and you could try to turn it into a data list, for example, but it might be quite long, quite tall, if you end up with lots of information in there. But what we tend to do all the time is actually looking into the content of what we have, whatever component we have, and not just packaging it kind of for mobile, kind of adjusting it for mobile, but actually looking into the content, right? So if we look at it, we can export the content, repackage it, rethink how we can display it, and actually show it properly on the mobile view. So this table does not have to stay a table. It could be a table and a data list, for example, where you just look exactly at the content, extract it, repackage it, and put it differently. So because those 4 things are really important, we're going to highlight them, right? And the rest is going to be displayed as a data list because it needs more content, needs more space. And obviously things like that are much easier to make responsive because you don't have this fixed structure that you had in the previous example. So you can actually squeeze it in as much as you like, right? So kind of repackaging and rethinking can be really, really helpful. One example for this is also NFL playoff coverage, where you have a really complex table. Let's see if I can actually zoom it, right? Things like this, right? Now, making that responsive is probably not that easy, right? I mean, there is a certain consistency that is required when you want to display a tournament map, right? You could, of course, reshuffle, you could move things around, you could turn it into one column, but this is not the point. It should actually be like in this view. So what you could potentially do, of course, is manipulate with them, play a little bit with the padding, play a little bit with the margins, kind of increase, decrease the font size, things like that. But at some point, it's just so tiny, right? And you can't do much. So you have to rethink what you do. In that case, they decided to turn it into a slider, where you have AFC league displayed by default, and then you can slide over and see the NFC league, right? But you could do it slightly differently as well, because you could actually have a very compact view, one-page view, and you could just change the fidelity that is appearing here. You don't necessarily need the logos in that size, right? They could be smaller, maybe. And maybe you don't need all the details in here. Maybe they could be appearing on, as a accordion with progressive disclosure. They should be available because of content parity, but we don't need to show everything in one place, right? But actually, if we change the fidelity a little bit, it might work just as well, too. So when it comes to tables, we can prioritize important columns. We can use steppers for navigation, like moving in steps between different columns. We can visualize content if we want to, reposition heading, adjust the level of fidelity, and extract content and redesign it, right? So these are very basic solutions, but they can always be a really good head start to really get your project going. Now there are obviously more components and other components that we need to keep in mind as well. And they're a bit smaller. Now, Patty Tolan from the Filament Group, she's talking a lot about actually layering various levels of experiences and functionality. When you think about a responsive project, or basically every responsive component that you're designing as a sort of pyramid, right? So you think about speed first, then access, then scale, and then style. So which means you need to make sure that your component, or your website, of course, performs. You need to make sure that your component is accessible. You need to make sure that it's scalable. So this is where kind of responsive breakpoints and greets and things come into place. And then at some point, you will style it, right? But thinking about it in this hierarchy is really, really useful when it comes to any component. Who thinks that this is totally useless? I mean, you can't change the fidelity of an icon based on the screen, width or height. But why would you do that? Who has an idea, a really practical use case for this? And who fell asleep already? Okay, not so many. That's good. Well, there is a very practical use case for this, and it's, of course, branding or logos. Because logos tend to have a lot of space, require a lot of space. And, and very often it's really not required. Now, if you look at this data, right, what is the first thing people do when they actually access a random or more or less random page on the web, on the mobile device? Well, the first thing they do is scrolling down. And why do they scroll down? Because we put all the things like navigation and the logo and advertising, of course, and potentially like install me, please, 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 pop-ups at the top, which people really don't care about, so they scroll down. So we should be really careful about this precious space, both for vertical and horizontal, that we display up front. So logo can actually occupy a lot of space. And of course, depending on complexity, because we do want to show it sharply, it's a logo after all, we do need to be careful how to design it. So here are the few options. Like if you have a really complex logo like this, it would probably occupy maybe 60, 70, 80 pixels, which takes a lot of vertical space. So we could just reduce the fidelity, maybe change the thickness of the lines to make it really still look sharp and clean. Can you move into the light stand? Camera lighting. Ah, here, but I can't see anything. All right, okay, cool. Yeah, let's pretend it never happened. So, right, so if you have a logo, you can actually adjust the thickness of the lines, for example, or really change the text, or actually remove the text, because otherwise it wouldn't look sharp, right? Because it's really not necessary to just keep it as is, and if you want to scale it down, it's not going to look good. A more common use case is actually to reposition the logo a little bit. So this takes a lot of vertical space, but this does not, right? I know what you're saying. My client will kill me if I do this. Well, try. I mean, the chances are high that they will not kill you, right? And also the other thing is, obviously, if you have logos like complex logos like this, where you have a lot of text surrounding your logo, you really do need to think about the different levels of fidelity. Because otherwise, this text is just not going to be readable at all. So you really have to rethink. And I'm talking about vertical space here, and I think that it's really, really important. And we should be thinking about vertical spacing, but also vertical media queries. Here is the Southwest example. And in Southwest, if you actually, well, they use this kind of pattern where it's not animated. That's weird. Okay. If you have a lot of items, oh, now it's animated. If you have a lot of items, they're just going to be stacked in a smaller view. So if you have a not tall enough screen, you will not be able to see all the items, right? Which is kind of just not future-proof. So we can actually search specifically for the height, right? And then based on the height, just change one of the items to more plus or whatever, and then use it as an accordion or progressive disclosure. In fact, I would argue that in many cases, we tend to think that if a device has a certain width, it's a mobile device. We tend to make this assumption. I think it's wrong on many levels, but the other way around is actually much better, because if we think about height instead of width, that's a much better indicator that the device is a mobile device, right? Because if you actually have a wide screen, you might have something running on the right side, and you might have something running on the left side. On the left side, you might have your browser. So the width might be not that big, right? But the height is going to be really big still. It's not like you're really trying to have 25% of your screen dedicated to a browser, right? So the height is going to be big. But if the height is not big, then it's maybe an indicator that it's a mobile device. Not necessarily if the width is small, right? So this is a difference. So I would actually really watch out for the height. And there are many things we can do. So for example, if you have a navigation like this, which was used in a BMW website, you can just search for the height, kind of just track the height with media queries, right? Because you actually do want this more button. It's kind of important to stay in place all the time, right? So you can actually always put it up just based on height alone. And then if you don't have a lot of space to show it, you can actually just move the items to the left or the right and so on and so forth. So I think that vertical media queries are really underrated, but can be extremely, extremely useful too. So what do we do with maps? Let's say this example, right? So we have a map, and it kind of serves as a filter. So you have all the different states, and you click on one of the states, or tap on one of the states, and you get some information about the projects in that state. Now, it works wonderfully if you have tall device, large device, large screen, but it doesn't work that well, of course, for smaller screens because we have fat fingers. So what are we going to do about this? Well, think about progressive enhancement again, right? When we start with simple select drop-down, which just works everywhere, and if we have space to show the entire thing, we just show the map and load it conditionally. It just works. Because otherwise, it wouldn't make sense to display that map. It just wouldn't be usable at all. Another interesting idea to keep in mind is, if you have really little, small selections that users can do, just allow them to select multiple countries, for example, as they do here. So here you can actually tap and get a selection of several countries, and then based on that selection, you can actually really make a precise input, right? So you tap in here, please, tap, please, right? And then you can actually select what exactly you actually want, right? Instead of zooming maybe 50 times or so. Maps are kind of tricky though. If you have to embed lots of maps in your site, on your page, it's probably going to be Google Maps embeds, Google Maps iframes. Or if you have like free Google Maps iframes, this is not good for anybody. Your users come to your page and they start scrolling down, and all of a sudden they swim in this ocean of the iframe and they try to get out, but they can't, and they try, and they try, and at some point they just close the window, right? So, can we do it better? Well, there are two options. Well, one of them is to just put something like we call an ice layer on top of the map, so it's still loaded, but if you scroll down, you're kind of scrolling over an empty div, more or less empty div, right? And when you tap on that map, it crashes, like ice. Whatever, right? So, and it's kind of nice, of course it happens only once, so, this is not good, and of course the map is loaded anyway. And the other thing is, well, what if we actually do it slightly different? We can just show the image of a map, or a screenshot of a map with a link to it. So if people want to actually explore the actual map, they can click on the map and get to it. They can click on the button and get to it. But if we have more space available, we could actually show the map, right? The same goes for lightboxes, because this is probably the experience that most of you have on a mobile device with lightboxes. So you click on an image, and you want to see it larger, but you see it smaller. Why? Because they have interface controls on the left, on the right, you can kind of navigate, and also you need a frame around the image, of course. This is just not useful, right? So instead, what could we do? Well, we could just, okay, I better stop this animation. We could just link directly to the image instead of linking to the lightbox, and if we have enough space, we can actually prompt a lightbox. This is what Facebook does all the time, where on the smaller screen, they never show up a lightbox. It's always a separate page. But on a desktop view and mobile device, it's actually a lightbox. Kind of makes sense, really. It's basic, there is no magic in here. Also, other components, like really simple ones. Here is the progress bar indicator if you're checking out. How would you display it? Some people go ahead and actually create an accordion, which shows all of those tabs so you can move between them. Others actually do tabs. But it's really not necessary in many cases, because you are at step 1. You are not at step 4 yet. If you were at step 4, maybe you want to access step 1, but you can't jump from 1 to 4, right? So what you can do instead is just replacing this with step 1 out of 5 and the title of this step, right? And when you're moving to the next one, maybe it would be a good idea to actually have something like tabs. Or maybe you can just drop it as it is and just show again step 2 out of 5, whatever the title is, right? But of course, it would be nice to have something like a few interface controls so you can move between those steps, either in tabs or differently, right? And this is also what, for example, the Swiss Air does. Swiss Air is a really great example for general experience. So if you actually just want to look into little details, little components, Swiss Air is really, really good. So for example, when you have a progress indicator here, right, and then just turns into simple steps, and the text is, I think it was displayed at least in the past, right under it, but not anymore. Another thing is this, carousels. My heart beats now, carousels. So how many of you like, or genuinely like carousels? 4, 5, 6? Well, the real ones too, yeah, they count too. Right. So can somebody in this room give me a very good reason why I, not being drunk, will want to click here, here, or on one of those dots? Why would I want to click there? I don't know either, to be honest. Now, many of the carousels we see on the web are really just poorly designed. This is everywhere. I mean, I have nothing against this guy, just to be clear, right? Nothing. But I think that this is just, it doesn't give me a clue why I should click on it. It's getting even worse sometimes. This is probably one of my favorite examples. This is a carousel, and these are controls to use it. And there is nothing else, no arrows. These are the controls to use it. Why would I want to click on one of those dots? Seriously. And we say, well, wait a second. We know carousels, yeah, carousels are dead. We don't need carousels. We all agree that carousels should not be used. It's all very clean. There is a fantastic website that gives you an answer as a carousel. So you know exactly that you should not use it, right? And it's often based on studies, very valid studies. If you look at the site I just showed before, they actually checked how many people click through the carousel, right? So the first image is seen by nearly everybody, right? Well, not everybody, but most people. 3% see image 2, 3% see image 3, 3% see image 4, 3% see image 5. What does it tell us? Out of 100 people, there are always 3 weirdos clicking everywhere, right? But most people do not use carousel, at least not in this design. So, because there is really no reason. But we can say, whoa, wait a second. We know. We're going to fix it. We're just going to show the image, the first image randomly, right? Then all images get the same share. Yeah, well, but if you can just show one image randomly, you don't have to show the entire carousel randomly, right? This is just weird. But you can say, oh, wait a second. We can animate it. So it's kind of automatically rotating, so people are forced to see everything. Yes, but please don't do that. Please never do this. And it's interesting that Amazon has been redesigning their carousel, and they were unhappy with the conversion rate, so they actually changed a few things. And this is the carousel. It doesn't have weird interface controls. It has these little blocks over here on the right, which provide a thumbnail and some text about, the next offers. And according to them, it's been really successful, and they're rolling it out on every category page. So it is a carousel, just not a badly designed one, right? It kind of makes sense. So maybe carousels are not bad, because this doesn't feel like a carousel per se. And carousel is not a bad pattern. I mean, accordion is very similar to carousel if you think about it. Another thing is, what do we do in magazines? So if we have lots of articles, right, we might have side notes and we might have footnotes, and sometimes side notes are obviously on the side and footnotes are at the bottom. Well, but it's kind of a weird experience, because if you have to jump to the footnotes and then jump back, there is a lot of jumping around. But at the same time, if you have side notes, well, in a small view, in a mobile view, you end up with this side note being somewhere between paragraphs. So you could have this kind of experience, right? Where you have things sliding from the bottom if you don't have space, or you can actually slide it right here as a little bubble. Right, so you can really integrate it into content. So if it's a side note or a footnote, it doesn't have to be displayed at the very bottom of the page. It could look like this as well. And this brings me to something that I really care about so much, and I'm not sure why, maybe because I'm a weird person, but PDFs. And yes, I just said PDFs. Can we make PDFs responsive? We talk about images not blocking rendering, but we talk about JavaScript blocking rendering. PDF are render blocking. PDFs are render blocking, because if you need to get to page 18 in a PDF document, you need to have downloaded 17 pages before to get there, right? This is not good. Why do I need to wait? Especially if you have a bad connection, you end up with downloading those huge PDF files, which just occupy take a lot of time to download. So here's a really nice example for this, where if you want to download the PDF, you can go ahead and download the PDF file, right? It's 2 meg, so if you're on a bad connection, it might be difficult. But at the same time, they automatically generate thumbnails of each page, heavily compressed as PNGs, right? And each of them is like 30 kilobyte in size. And obviously, they're not, print quality, but you can get to the content without having to download the PDF file altogether, which I think is really, really good. And they also add this interface controls, which you probably don't need, but, it's really, really nice, and it really helps you get away with this. Right? So PDFs do not have to be render blocking. But I know you say, well, but our sites look a bit different. Our sites look a bit more like this all the time, right? Ooh, why is it moving? It's not supposed to be moving. I'm sorry. It's probably automated rotation. No? Mm-hmm. And now I'm wasting everybody's time. I'm so sorry about this. It's not supposed to be moving. I don't know why. So can somebody tell a joke or something in the meantime? Oh, damn it, but okay, it doesn't matter. Because we tend to have a lot of sites that have very special design, right? Sometimes. Maybe something like this, we have a lot of complexity going on. So here you've got on Typekit, have lots of elements visually, but most importantly, if you actually scroll down, you see, of course, lots of those blobs, content blobs, if you like. things like this, right? Now, making this responsive is not easy, probably, but what you can always do is just try to turn it into blocks and just show them all, but then it's going to be a really tall page. That's not good. So what you can do instead is actually using a slider, again, for any kind of complexity, because otherwise it's going to be a really tall page. So what you can do instead is just turning these blocks into this area, like an iframe, a swipeable area with a slider. I didn't know that I could slide until I actually slided, so it might be a good idea to have interface controls to move to the left, to the right, and so on and so forth, right? But this really helps to some degree. If you have a really complex presentation of any sort, this can be quite helpful, right? Just this kind of pattern. Because I think that in general, if we actually think about all those components, and sometimes we have really custom, really complex components, if you can do this in responsive design, you can do pretty much everything in responsive design. It's almost like magic. Adaptive musical notation, where the spacing is calculated and drawn in canvas based on the width and the height, right? And redrawn all the time you actually need to make the change, which is pretty remarkable. And you think, well, this is not exciting enough. I like typography. Well, this is exciting for me. This is like, when I see that, I can't talk anymore. Because this is not just an image being scaled down. This is the spacing and the glyphs being recalculated on the fly as you resize the viewport, right? So, for example, the spacing, the kerning, the ligatures, everything is really recalculated on the fly. And this is like, wow. This is the point where I totally freak out. Like, totally freak out. It's like breathing type, right? Which is also responsive. It's just unbelievable. Okay, I should really stop at this point, I think, right? Oh, this is also pretty cool. It might sound like demo, and you might not use it all the time, right? But just knowing that you can do things like that, if necessary, with a little bit of SVG and JavaScript, is really unbelievable. It's really, really cool. So, speed and access first, scale and style later. Flipping, just kind of moving from horizontal view to vertical view for one column layout is not good enough in many cases. You can think about different views for infographics, for example, kind of changing the view. In general, we always have to do one thing, look at the content, at the essence of the component, and try to break down its complexity into something more manageable, and kind of repackage the content in a more meaningful way, right? We can also prompt a list view for small tab areas, as we did in the map example, right? And we can also please load maps and lightboxes conditionally. And apart from that, carousels need context. Breadcrumbs can be tabs or accordions. We can use vertical media queries a lot. We can use, okay, I kind of skipped it, show product comparisons full screens. It's always kind of a thing. Very often you go on a page and you want to compare two products, but they're really, really either too big or too small, so you can't really do that. Just use full view for this, right? A separate, either a lightbox or just a separate page for this. You can also use inline side notes, footnotes, provide thumbnails for PDF pages, right? Well, I have like many pages, many slides to go to, so I'm sorry, you'll get the slides anyway. How many minutes? 2 minutes. They wanted okay, so I'm going to waste these minutes now. So they actually really wanted to drag me out of the workshop yesterday, right? And we kept going and going and going, and they did. But I said, well, you know what? The people who want to leave, want to stay, let's just go to a coffee shop and continue. So we can do that. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just messing around. Right. So maybe just to conclude, and then if you have any questions, you can always find and ask me. So there are, again, lots of those components, right? But the thing is really important to think strategically about many of them, because for many of them, you can really find a good solution and base your solution on top of existing one. You don't have to reinvent the wheel all the time. You can be efficient and still stay creative, right? It's just really good to have those pointers when you know exactly, okay, table, I know what to do with table. I'm not going to do exactly that, but maybe I can figure out a way of actually making it better, right? Because in the end, all of those examples are, again, not to be copy-pasted. They're not trends. They're not that fancy as parallax or whatever, but they're little things that can actually really help make your website faster, better, more responsive, and also help you to build those websites faster and without spending too much time on what's unnecessary. With that in mind, please do find me in the break. Okay, I clicked, and now it works. Okay, thank you for your attention.